Whenever anyone from the current administration talks of people and progressive ideals being radical and extreme, they are actually projecting of themselves. They're hiding behind a thinly veiled attempt at radicalizing this country into a white supremacist and white Christian nationalist caliphate. That's right, I said caliphate. Some liken the word caliphate to something being Islamic, but other words for caliph are emperor, king, monarch, and oligarch. So the word is applicable. As I've previously mentioned in other uploads, the war that they've waged has not been yet with bullets, guns, and with bloodshed. It's been an attempt at a massacre between the ears. What has been wrought upon this country over the past month and a half is a white supremacist and white Christian nationalist crusade of retribution and retaliation. It's also been a crusade against everything progressive by this country since its founding. In short, I'll go as far as to assert that if these people could take away the citizenship of millions of people, they would achieve the goal of denying outright any rights and privileges as it spells out under the law. Thus, if you're not someone whom they recognize, you're not a citizen of this country. Therefore, you'd have zero rights and you'd have zero protections under the law. Now, we've actually seen hints of this in the current administration's crusade against deporting people who entered this country illegally. But what's next? Groups of people to whom they've lined up between their crosshairs? Now, here's some examples. Already, it was pronounced recently that transgender people have 60 days to leave the U.S. military or they're likely to be dishonorably discharged from their service to this country. And those who are allowed to remain must receive a waiver that meets specific guidelines and tests. Then there's the executive orders that have declared that diversity, equity, and inclusion at the federal level no longer exists, and efforts are being made to freeze funding of the education, health, and social program systems. Then the people who are likely to be most affected by those executive orders are those who are economically disadvantaged, along with the historically marginalized groups of people. Now, the person behind all of this chaos being wrought in this country is Russell Vogt, who is regarded as the architect behind the manifesto and propaganda of Project 2025. Russell Vogt had infamously said long before he was confirmed again as serving director of the Office of Management and Budget that he wants to traumatize the federal workforce. This is while remaking the federal government to operate under a despot, tyrant, and dictator. In short, a caliphate. So you ask, what's in it for Russell Vogt? Now, it seems to me it's as if he gets his kicks out of believing that his legacy will be forever etched into this country's history as being the brain behind all of this carnage. In his service to the orange felon liar, Russell Vogt is one of his many enablers. He believes that he's doing his part, at least in my observation, to give that weak-minded stooge the adulation, worship, and genuflection that he craves by drafting policy and messaging that advances the orange felon liar's ideology and agenda, which we know ultimately is all about himself. Now, in order to understand Russell Vogt's agenda, here's a look at some of the things he's been on record as saying. He's a self-identified Christian nationalist. You might want to add white Christian nationalist. He was raised an evangelical. He attended an evangelical college in Illinois, Wheaton. The irony is that the college he attended was a private evangelical college whose origins were with the Methodist Church, which was founded by abolitionists in 1860, and it was known as a stop on the Underground Railroad. It's also known to have graduated one of the state's first black college graduates, and arguably one of its most famous alumnus is Billy Graham. So there's nothing out there that documents yet any timeline of when Russell Vogt became so radicalized, but it is known his career points include being a lobbyist for the Heritage Foundation, which backed the manifesto and propaganda known as Project 2025. It's known that Russell Vought is good at messaging, having been involved in GOP politics since the 1990s. He's even served as policy director for the GOP conference in the House of Representatives, and he also was the person who was over the Republican National Committee's policy in the 2024 election. Some of his known pet peeves are on the lines of morality, in that he's against transgenderism, he's against pornography, and he's against abortion. And he's also about the priority of Christendom and the legal arguments that gets rid of agencies within the federal government framework. He also despises efforts at diversity, equity, and inclusion because it also includes in his arguments transgenderism. He's sympathetic then to doing away with the Department of Education, Environmental Protection Agency, and various other social programs and agencies that promotes, you may say, the common good. He also has been on record as saying that Muslims don't know God because they've rejected Jesus and they stand condemned. Now, what's interesting is that certain radical Muslims believe people who are not like them are seen as infidels and they stand condemned. But anyway, while there are truths to suggest that this country is a racist nation in its roots and that racism is systematic, Russell Vought is vehement, and he's in vehement opposition of this, and had, during his first time as Office Management and Budget Director, sought to find ways to divert or cancel federal funding of programs on diversity, equity, and inclusion. And he argued that it engendered division and resentment within the federal workforce. Here's another known fact. Upon the end of the Orange Felon Liars' first term, Russell Vought created a think tank whose goal and mission was to debunk critical race theory and dismantle diversity, equity, and inclusion. As you know, these became talking points in political ammunition used by the GOP leading up to the 2024 elections. Also, because he sees the Orange Felon Liar as a target and to some degree a victim, this is fast becoming his opportunity to wreak retribution and retaliation against those who investigated him, impeached him, or found him to be guilty of his own acts and actions. Russell Vought has openly spoken of the belief that the Orange Felon Liar won the 2020 election and that he also believes in the lies that accompanied that assertion. That's right. And guess what, Russell Vought says? We have in him a man who is uniquely positioned to serve this role, a man whose own interests are perfectly aligned with the interests of this country. I'm going to ask, how so, and based on what election? Russell Vought goes on to say that he's seen what it has been done to him, and he's seen what it has tried to do to the country. He sees the Orange Felon Liar as more than a gift from God. So, given that he sees the Orange Felon Liar as a gift from God, and because the Orange Felon Liar wants to surround himself with people that will enable him to do as he damn well pleases, whether it's legal or not, whether it's ethical or not, whether it's really in the country's best interest or not, it's all about what is in the Orange Felon Liar's best interest. So then that means that Russell Vought, another of Russell Vought's goals is to ensure that the score is settled legally, legislatively, and executively. He does not believe that prior to this election, this country had lived under the Constitution. So then there's this thing about radical constitutionalism that Russell Vought is an advocate of, or what he's trying to advance. In short, he believes the president has the power to do as he wishes with the federal government. Government agencies, he argues, are unconstitutional, and they are a part of the administrative state as described in Project 2025. There are no independent agencies, Russell Vought says. They must be brought under the executive office oversight, and that means that all policies and initiatives must be aligned with the president's values. We might argue in this particular case, what values does this current president have? So this is a person, Russell Vought, who in effect has the pleasure of putting the final nail into the coffin of various government agencies and departments deemed not in line with their right wing agenda. This is why you hear the term unelected bureaucrats and why agencies have been cut of their funding since January 20th. Says Russell Volt. This is something that he said prior to the elections. We want the bureaucrats to be traumatically affected. When they wake up in the morning, he says, we want them not to go to work because they are increasingly viewed as the villains. We want their funding to be shut down. We want their funding to be shut down so that the EPA can't do all of the rules against our energy industry because they have no bandwidth financially to do so. We want to put them in trauma. So you got to remember, leading up to the election, the Democrats warned people about 2025. And then you had an orange felon liar who openly dismissed it. But you then had behind the scenes people like Russell Volt saying, don't worry about that. He's on board with us with all this stuff. But then you still have people who are surprised that this shit is being implemented and that is actually being done. And the speed and impact of the many moves by the current administration is what has made it so newsworthy, shocking, and to those affected, traumatizing. Now, as I've read more about this guy, Russell Volt, he's a fucking lunatic just as much as the orange felon liar is. J.D. Vance, the Nazi saluting apartheid baby, Elon Musk is, and pretty much the whole host of characters that comprise the current administration. So who keeps them together working in concert is probably a very taxing and complicated task in itself. But apparently Russell Volt is up to it. Simply put, too, this administration is full of people with ulterior motives. Orange felon liar happens to be its ringleader. Russell Volt is the zealot who hides behind the social conservatism, legal conservatism, and a warped view of Christianity that sadly resonates with a significant portion of this country. Now, according to varied reports available, Russell Volt worked his way up through the Republican Party ranks dating back to the 1990s. He is among a scant number of returnees from the orange felon liar's first administration. And the first time around, he was confirmed by the U.S. Senate by a count of 50 to 49, with then Vice President Mike Pence casting the deciding vote. So in that particular Senate confirmation, he worked as Deputy Director of the Office of Management of Budget, working under Mike Mulvaney. When Mike Mulvaney went on to become Chief of Staff, Russell Volt was confirmed by a 51-45 vote to become Director of Office of Management and Budget. And in January, he was confirmed to the same position by a vote of 53-47 by the U.S. Senate. Now, here's the thing. What we know about Russell Volt's white Christian nationalist views, the thing is that he doesn't deny his views in past statements. So here are some of the things that you can argue what the white Christian nationalists believe. They believe that this country was destined for white European Anglo-Saxons. In short, it was ordained by God. They argue that this country was founded upon Christian views. Well, what Christian views? Christian views are widely perceived as views of white people, hence white Christian nationalist beliefs. It's spelled out in Project 2025 how this country needs to return to its original moorings. Essentially, anything that is not aligned in their views is viewed as Marxist. It's considered antithetical, meaning it's contrary or opposing. And so it all falls under the category of woke and wokeism. So then what you have to understand, at least you have to understand with an open mind, is that this country's documents were drafted by a social and economic elite. That social and economic elite class of people were all rich white men. There were some who vigorously defended slavery, for example, and then there were some who came to an understanding that slavery was wrong. But the documents did not spell out specifically that all groups of people in this country were afforded the access to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. No, historically, the other groups of people have had to fight to be included into that language being allowed to pursue life, liberty, and happiness in this country, basically equal protection under the law, which is the premise of the 14th Amendment. So then, what they've been skillful at messaging, or at least what they've tried to do in their messaging, is that they can't come out and say that a specific race of people are the problem in this country, but they can demonize and vilify groups like transgendered people who are here illegally. But then what's next? Maybe they may go after those marginalized groups. So that means they may go after gays. They may go after the handicapped. They may go after the Latinos who are here legally. There's already the Muslim ban for those trying to come into the country, and then there's also how they're going after really blacks with diversity, equity, and inclusion. That's the code word for blacks, really. But this needs further explanation. If they talk about this country being founded upon Protestant Christian principles, they argue that this country has long since been in moral decay. That this country needs to be rescued, revived, if you will, from the malaise. So here's where a merging of white nationalism may be seen. White nationalists are viewed among the far right extremists as really Christian nationalists. White nationalists argue that they should maintain their dominance both politically and economically, and that their culture should be primary of utmost priority. Christian nationalists argue, as I've stated, that this country should return to its, quote, Christian origins, socially, politically, economically, and just as importantly, morally, and that Christianity should be primary and of utmost priority. So then, according to a white Christian nationalist, these are the rightful people who, according to this Constitution's wording, should enjoy then the life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness that it spells out. This prosperity can only occur if then that this country is rid of transgendered, illegal immigrants, legislation, and social practices that promotes diversity, equity, and inclusion. This can only occur too then if this country rids itself of non-Christian influences upon American society. So you get where I'm going. It's kind of a warped fucking view. So if you're not among them, you're not for them. You're against them. And this is their rallying cry. This is war to them. And in war, your goal is to eradicate, beat into submission, and take over and dominate. So then you rally your primary group of people by playing to their fears, grievances, and emotions. So then you talk about the price of eggs. You talk about the price of gas. People can relate to that. Then you talk about illegal immigrants. People can relate to that. You talk about being anti-discrimination, but in actuality, it's resegregation. People can relate to that. And by sophistication, you bump enough heads of people whom you eventually remind them that they're not one of them by feeding them with disinformation that they come to believe as truth. Yet those people who were manipulated for their cause are then unceremoniously reminded how they're not one of them. That is being white. Now, I might also want to add, most people associate the word Christian with being white. So when you talk of this country's founding and founding documents, you think of what was drafted by white, quote, Christian men. So what you're seeing by these people is then making every effort to reverse and undo laws and policies that may have brought a more diverse, equitable, and inclusive society. So this is why then there's been the push about banning books and programs and dismantling agencies. They want to rewrite history. They want to whitewash history. And the truths and any truth that paints them in a negative light, they want it abolished. They want it systematically dismantled. So then part of their argument too is that you can be both patriotic and nationalist. Patriotic means a love for the country. Nationalist means placing certain priorities over others, that being faith and race. So then what makes white Christian nationalism so dangerous, you might ask? First of all, it's steeped in idolatry and in heresy. What they espouse is a perversion of the gospel. It's cultic in that it is no different than, say, folk in Iran or even the group ISIS that once controlled swaths of the Middle East in recent memory. The difference is that they're also rooted in oligarchy and capitalism. So then it's all about exclusion, separation, and vilification. It's all about reparation and retaliation. They believe that they've got one chance to get it right. And this is what they spell out in Project 2025. And so what's going on right now has been a perfect storm to affect this country's direction for the next 50 to 75 years. In short, if they can do that, they can die as happy racists and happy fanatics. Politically, it's all about doing away with bureaucracy and carrying out an agenda that aligns singularly with the executive branch, that is the president or the president's office. In short, it's about an autocracy, it's about a dictatorship, it's about totalitarianism. So here's what Russell's vote says about that. The president has to move executively as fast and as aggressively as possible with a radical constitutional perspective to be able to dismantle that bureaucracy and that power center. That's what he says. He also says there are a couple of ways of doing it. Number one is going after the notion of independence, i.e., independent agencies. There are no independent agencies, he says. Congress may have viewed them as such, the whole alphabet soup, but that is something that the Constitution understands. So there may be different strategies as to how you dismantle them. These are all direct quotes. But as an administration, the whole notion of an independent agency should be thrown out. So that means to him, no such agency in the executive branch is independent and can be independent of the president. He may have some constitutional covering because of the Chevron deference case of 1984 being overturned. Now, really, if you kind of look at what Russell Vought's doing, he's almost acting independently of the president by all the programs cutting, getting rid of people, defunding of programs, getting rid of people, and vilifying them as he has. But it's not independent of the president in that supposedly the orange felon liar is fully aware of what's going on. So then here's the deal. The Office of Management and Budget creates the president's budget, which is then submitted to Congress, which decides on how the money is spent. And at least that's been the understanding for the past 247 years, according to the Constitution. In theory, the Office of Management and Budget then oversees the approved budget and ensures the money is being spent as prescribed. So then, here's the thing. Russell Vogt believes that all policies and initiatives should be in line with the president's values. And that may be a valid statement, but to what extent? Russell Vogt believes then that there is a separation of power, but then again, not exactly a separation of power. He sees the federal hierarchy as not three co-equal branches of government. That is the judiciary, the legislative, and executive. They're not co-equal, which is then the principle of checks and balances that has been practiced now for centuries. No, what he argues is that the judiciary and the legislative merely conforms to the executive branch. So then, as I kind of sum everything up, Russell Vogt himself may be arguably seen as more powerful than the orange felon liar himself. He's an insider. He understands government. He understands law. And what makes him more powerful is his onslaught of taking away the money that denies the funding, despite the fact that Congress is the co-equal branch of government that has this role. For example, then, when Russell Vogt was asked during his confirmation hearings, does he believe the president has the power to set interest rates? Russell Vogt didn't answer that question. He answered to the effect that his role is to do everything possible to execute the president's agenda. He says, it is important for the president to have someone in this role that wants to accomplish his agenda and not their own agenda. That is what I'm known for, and that's what I'll continue to be if confirmed. The answer to that question that Russell Vogt should have answered was that the Federal Reserve Board is the agency that sets interest rates. The Federal Reserve Board acts independent of the executive and legislative branches, but the Federal Reserve Board's head, the director, the Federal Reserve Board's head, the chairman of the Federal Reserve Board, is appointed by the president and is confirmed by Congress. That's what the answer should have been.